Hi, I'm Len Epp from LeanPub, and in this episode of the Front Matter podcast, I'll be interviewing Jared Knowles. Based in Watertown, Massachusetts, Jared is a statistical programmer and social scientist and founder and president of Civilytics Consulting, a data science consulting company that provides analysis and data science software solutions in the criminal justice, public finance, and education sectors. You can follow him on Twitter at jknowles and check out his website at jaredknowles.com. And you can learn more about Civilytics at civilytics.com and at Civilytics on Twitter. Jared is co-author of two books that have been published on LeanPub: Education Data Done Right, Lessons from the Trenches of Applied Data Science, and Education Data Done Right, Volume 2, Building on Each Other's Work. In these books, Jared and his colleagues write about the missing elements that are critical to success in building data capacity in education agencies, addressing the important work being done by data scientists and others in the education sector across the United States, helping schools and leaders in education to shape everything from policy to law to strategic planning and managing enrollments. In this interview, we're going to talk about Jared's background and career, professional interests, his books, and at the end, we'll talk a little bit about his experience as a writer and co-author. So thank you very much, Jared, for being on the LeanPub Front Matter podcast.
Thanks so much for having me. It's great to be here.
I always like to start these interviews by asking people for their origin story. So I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about where you grew up and how you found yourself on the path to a career in social science and data science and political science.
I think geography is a really big part of what I do now and also my origin story. So I was actually born and raised in Montana in the United States, which is a pretty rural part of the country, very large and very sparsely populated. I grew up in a small town there, and I moved to a smaller town to go to high school. And what I kind of saw when I changed towns was how different the school system changed. As a kid, you're very plugged into the school system, and so you can get a real sense of the difference is between how adults in the school system are acting when you move between the school systems. And I thought we're still in the same state, we're still generally the same kinds of people, the same economy, yet these two towns had very different school systems, and it got me really thinking about politics and school boards. So I wanted to get out of Montana as fast as I could when I graduated, so I went to college in Oregon. And so I went further west, and I went out to college outside of Portland. And there I really studied school boards in college. And that was what I got really interested in, what I wanted to do my graduate work in, was really to learn about this phenomenon in the United States about how we run schools with these very local elected officials. And a couple of hops and a jump, and I went to graduate school in Wisconsin. So I kind of stayed along the northern part of the United States. I guess I said I didn't like winter, but I stay in cold places. And while I was there, I realized that in graduate school, I wanted to do something more hands-on. And so I started working for the state government in Wisconsin. I worked there for 6 really pleasant years. I've learned a lot about working in state government and the way state government sort of works and interacts with school systems. So I was working in the education department. Then I moved to Watertown outside of Boston, Massachusetts, when my spouse got a job here. And that's when I decided to start Civilytics, because I had identified while I was working for state government some things that could be better served if I was sort of outside of government, and wanted to see if that could work. And 5 years, we just had our 5-year anniversary this year for Civilytics, and the book's a big part of that. And so that's kind of how we got to where we are now in a nutshell.
Thanks for sharing that really great story. I'm from Saskatchewan originally myself, in the middle of Canada. So I know what it's like to come from cold, sparsely populated places. And actually, I went to 6 different schools from kindergarten to grade 12. So I know what it's like to sort of notice differences like that. Do you remember the first difference that struck you as a kid, between one school system and another?
I think the biggest difference that was really immediate to me was one school was very academic, it's still public high school, but it was very academically focused, or at least there was a place to be very academically focused and challenged. In the school I moved to, not to say to anything too unkind, but I felt immediately that there was not a set of adults who were really caring about really academically challenging the students. That wasn't the focus of the school system. And you felt it in every class, and sort of in the expectations and in the policies of the school. So I think that was one of the big differences.
Yeah, that's really interesting. I had a couple of experiences like that myself. Actually, it's I think of it as one of my own. I didn't know this before this interview, but we shared this sort of experience of like noticing when you're young that there's kind of policy and that there's people that are deciding what you're being taught and that it can change. And for me, the experience wasn't across different schools. It was from year to year. At one school I was going to, I realized, oh, like one year, literally, it was the worst thing you could do to swear on the playground during recess. So there would be teachers out there wagging their finger at you or, punishing you in some way for swearing. And then the next year, swearing was basically encouraged as an expression of freedom and wild imagination and stuff like that. And I remember thinking, oh, wow, this is like, I didn't have the word in my mind, right? But this is arbitrary.
Yeah.
This is what and I knew it didn't just apply to the things I noticed changing. It applied to the things that would be same year for, they could have been different. They could change at any time.
Yep.
There's people behind it, and those people aren't authorities, in fact, on this in the sense that one would naively understand an authority to act. They're just deciding, and they're deciding based on whatever.
Yes.
And I remember not actually resenting it, but just being kind of like, well, I guess that's what school is.
Yeah.
And it is very curious when to notice like that thing about the world. And so in university, you said you were at, I can see here from LinkedIn, you were at the Pacific University.
Yeah.
You studied politics and government, and then you did a graduate degree in political science. And then you, as you mentioned, you went into you became a public servant in Wisconsin. What was that change like from being a graduate student to being in government?
I did something that I would never recommend anyone listening do, which is that I did them at the same time even. I was actually in graduate school, and I got the bug for statistical programming, and I had a statistics course that was required that I wasn't that interested in, but was required. And they forced us to use this open source tool. At the time was pretty rough and ready, called R. It's now a very popular statistical programming tool. But at the time it was still a little new and experimental, and there was no instruction given on how to do it. We just had to do all our homework using it. But I kind of took to that and enjoyed it. And I was kind of given a choice that I could either work as an intern in the governor's office, or I could work on a big kind of experiment that was going on, that the university was running at schools across the country. And the experiment project didn't really strike my fancy, but this idea of getting to work in the governor's office, that sounded pretty interesting for me as a political scientist, a chance to see what it really looks like. I was helping implement an application for a federal fund. So I was just helping a team write an application. But I made a few graphs for the application, and they really liked that. And they were like, oh, wow, like these graphs are useful. And looking back now, I could have done them in Excel or something. It wasn't anything really fancy, but they liked that. And they said, why don't you come do an internship at the state education agency? And I said, well, I'm not going to stop doing my degree. And they said, oh, we could probably work it out. And so I started off working part-time, and then I started working full-time and doing my graduate degree part-time, and sort of just kind of transition. But I always had my foot in both of those worlds, which was a really interesting experience and really did shape a lot of the way I think about what Civilytics does now, thinking about the importance of being that bridge between those two different worlds, and how they can help each other, and the ways they can lose track of communicating with each other.
And were you jealous of your fellow PhD candidates who didn't have full-time jobs?
Well, if you know anything in the U.S. about compensation, it's it's much better to work for the government than it is to work at the university. You get a much fairer salary and benefits package. So I did it. That was a motivating factor for me very much.
And I guess this is a bit of a detail, but so did you teach yourself programming in R? You said you took a course on statistics. So they must have given you some introduction.
There was some introduction, and then I did pursue several courses in my methods sequence, and then went beyond it to keep taking courses that sometimes the instructors were good and were interested in teaching us R. Other times they were just giving us material and kind of throwing us the goal and saying, get to the goal, and then giving you the space to learn it. So I took things in many different branches so that I could learn how to use R to do different things like geospatial statistics and multi-level models and all kinds of different tools that just kind of allowed me that space to learn.
And were there like online courses and stuff available to you at the time that you were aware of? Or?
I made an online course, so it was pretty early days. I made this R for education researchers because I was trying to help other government agencies adopt R. because the license fees for statistical software can be a real barrier to departments being able to adopt those tools. That's less of a problem now, I think. So I mostly used books, some key books, and a lot of hands-on time at work, being able to. Luckily, my supervisors give me the space to really solve a problem well and use R to do it, and then learn from that experience.
You mentioned you made some charts that people really liked, and I saw preparing for this interview. I watched an interview or a talk that you gave a few years ago. It's on YouTube. I'll put a link to it in the transcription, where you show a number of charts that you do, and you explain, I think, very well the role of the I guess, let's say, public servant in the education sector, and the way that, like, what you're primarily doing is trying to advise people who make decisions. And so if you show them, say, a chart that you're kind of working on to sort of figure out where to go, that's not useful to them. You need to show them a finished thing that makes a point. And you have this really great chart where you show, basically, it's something along the lines of you tested a bunch of different models to see how well they'd work, and the idea was we should probably choose one of these models going forward for predicting something like graduation rates or something like that. And if you had just shown the sort of line showing which one was more predictable, was better at predicting outcomes, and it's just sort of, that's the line that's higher on the chart than the lines that are lower than it, that would have been something. But what you did was you plotted it against how good at predicting outcomes the other systems across the country were. And you showed that the best model that you'd come up with intersected with the best performing one across the other states. And so when you showed that chart to somebody, now they can go, like, which one do you want to choose? Well, I want to choose the one where I can tell people we're choosing this one because it's as good as the best in the country. And I was just wondering if you could talk, did that sort of awareness that was what your job was come to you initially, or did you come to that over time?
Definitely over time. That's definitely a hard won lesson of making, I do a lot of training for data analysts, education data analysts, and that's where a lot of the ideas in the book come from too. And I think a big part of it for me was, like, I did get this big initial win. Like, people were interested in my charts. Like, no one was interested in what I had to say before that. So I was like, came into the office and was like, well, I can make charts all day. Let's have interesting conversations. And what I realized is not everyone is interested in the charts, first of all. And second of all, it takes a lot of people to agree to make a decision in the end, especially a consequential decision that's going to shape education policy. And so then it's about, well, all those different folks need a way to make a decision, and you have to sort of listen carefully to what they are interested in, what their perspective is, and try to really understand their position. So then you can come up with that chart and say, I think this solves the questions that you have in a way that gives you the ability to now make a decision. And if we've done our work, that means that it looks very simple, the chart, but it sort of is the tail end of a lot of work of listening and identifying what is going to be the piece that makes the decision straightforward enough that everyone can feel comfortable about it, feel like it was a legitimate decision, and feel like their perspective was considered in it.
Yeah, and you make a joke in the talk about how their decision in the end was kind of inevitable given the way you presented and structured the chart, which on one level sounds manipulative, but when you're clear that, like, no, this is the end result of a lot of work and careful consideration in the context for what the best outcome is, and so what you're actually presenting is an argument.
Yeah, and I think it's clear. It's good to be explicit that it almost always is. And if you're doing data analysis for a purpose, it is an argument. We're not just doing it to speculate or to just amuse ourselves. We are going to choose to do something different. And so, being explicit about that, it is an argument, and that you should show people that they had their voice in it through the whole process. And I think that's a big part of what I had to learn, was that everyone's going to if you show that chart and you didn't do the 8 hours of listening with all the different stakeholders in the room and the different conversations with them, they're going to look at that chart very different than if they've had a conversation with you. They trust you. They know you heard their concerns and you showed them how you heard their concerns. Then you present the chart and they're going to say, yeah, great. This confirms what are all of our best hopes, and we feel comfortable with this, and we're going to support this decision moving forward.
It's interesting how granular the sort of situational awareness you need to have in situations like that is, particularly even with respect to individual people, as you're saying, having listened to them. I have a story I like to tell from back in my investment banking days when I was putting together a chart showing some, projections for some revenues or something like that. And one of my colleagues said, that chart's too toothy. You can't show that to, Martin. And I was like, what do you mean? Like, that's the chart. Like, that's those numbers. And he's like, no, like change the scale on the y-axis so it's not so spiky. And I said, no, this is the scale that we use for projections of this kind, and I remember flicking to the next slide in the meeting, and this guy goes, why is it so toothy?
I love that word too, toothy.
Toothy,
it's so great.
Yeah. And I learned, like, of course, like, you say, like, you would say this is a different scale than usual, blah blah blah, and it wasn't that there was any sort of manipulation, I would say, going on. It's just that people have their quirks, and actually those, like, you're doing data science, you're doing social science, but you're also doing people when you're doing something like that, and you need to keep those kind of things in mind. But that leads me to ask a question. So one thing I've found is that often when you show people numbers and when you show them charts, they think what you're showing them is reality. And no matter how explicit you are about this is the result of a lot of analysis and conjecture and assumptions, there's a certain kind of person that just thinks, no, you've shown me reality. I'm going to go out and tell people this is the proportion of kids that are going to graduate in 5 years. What do you do in your experience? What can you do in your experience that you've learned to help kind of mitigate that problem?
Yeah, I actually think it's a two-sided problem, because I spent most of my early career worried about the flip side of the coin, which is people who, no matter how much data and evidence you show them, they're going to go with their gut, and like, I think both attitudes toward data can be dangerous in an organization. Either we're not going to listen to data because we have a lot of good intuition or gut or historical knowledge, and we're going to stick with what's always worked, or like we're going to do whatever the data says. The next step is always going to be determined by whether the bar graph went up or down or whatever our KPI is, and we're not going to step back and be critical. And so, when we kind of talk about with clients about data strategy, that's like one of the most important things I talk to them about. Is it feels good as a data analyst to talk to the people who are like, well, thank you for that. We are going to, do X because you recommended X. Like, you can get caught up in that, and you might not actually be doing the service that you want to be doing, because actually, as a data analyst, all of the reasons why there are asterisks after those figures and what the threats to the validity of the analysis are. And you need to have some very clear responsibility about how to communicate that part of it as well. And we don't really have like a bullet graph that's really cool to show people how sort of uncertain to be about whether or not we're even counting the thing we want to measure correctly. So I think, it's having, as a data scientist, thinking about you holding the knowledge of the whole process of how the data gets collected, to the analysis, to the reporting, and being able to communicate and weigh all of what you've learned through that whole process as a holistic result, instead of saying the KPI is 7. And so that, we already predetermined that if it was 7, we would do X. And if it was 6, we would do Y. That sounds efficient, but unless everything else is right and tight, you don't want to be making decisions that way.
Your dissertation topic I see here was school boards and the democratic promise. This was, I think you finished it in 2015. School boards and the democratic promise, I suppose, are very topical these days. And I was just wondering if you could talk a little bit about what your thesis was about.
Sure. I have to reach back into my mind. I don't talk about it very much actually anymore, but there's like a fundamental tension in political science about, like, how do we measure what is a democratic government, right? So, you'll if you went to civics in the United States, the United States isn't a democracy, it's a republic, which is like one step back from a democracy because we don't vote on the laws ourselves or whatever. And political scientists have a lot of different ways of categorizing and thinking about how democratic is a sort of institution or government of any kind. And one of the things that you kind of learn is the amount that people participate really is important. So if you have free and fair elections, but only 10% of people vote, then people might say it's in theory a democracy, but it's actually not a democracy because only 10% of people are making the decision. So this is an academic debate. And, United States doesn't have great voter participation across the board, but we have particularly abysmal voter participation for local elections. And in Wisconsin at the time, our school board elections were off cycle. So they were not on the standard, presidential governor cycle. They were in the spring. And so they were even lower turnout. But there was an event that happened while I was in Wisconsin where the governor changed the power that school boards had and gave them a lot more power over their workers and basically made them able to overrule any union bargaining agreements with teachers. So now school boards were really important because if you put in a school board that was in favor of the teachers at that moment, you could protect all of the workers' rights that teachers had won. And if you put in a school board that was sort of in favor of the new law, you could drastically reshape the way teachers were compensated and really enact a lot of reforms that were not possible under collective bargaining before. So there was this moment where the school board was really critical, but it was still off cycle. So my theory was to test whether or not voters were aware of that. We had a special governor election to make them aware that this was an issue. So they were aware of it. And then did that affect how people behaved in the school board election? Did more people run for school board? Did more people lose their seats in school board? So did they turn over more voters than more board members than before? And was there higher participation? And the answer is that, yeah, there kind of was. We did see a spike. So the idea is that perhaps normally school boards aren't that democratic, but maybe when things are really important to the voters, they still have, there's no barriers to them really participating. And so they can express their democratic will. I wouldn't be comfortable saying it was a conclusive study of that. And I wouldn't believe that it was, I don't think that that's necessarily true, but I think it did show that a lot of times in political science, we kind of think of school boards as not very democratic, but I think they're maybe more democratic, and there's more ways to think about it than mainstream political science at the time had really been thinking about them. So that was a way to sort of test the electoral nature of school board politics.
I'm really curious, did this change in the law give the school boards more opportunity to kind of basically tell teachers what to teach? You mentioned specifically it was kind of compensation and things like that, but did that give them, that's obviously a powerful lever. Was that a concern that people have, or was that a thing that a power that those school boards then actually had?
And not in the specific context of Wisconsin. School boards do have that power, but the power was really focused on compensation, leave, professional development time, things that were costing money because the school districts were in a fiscal crisis across the state because of the Great Recession. And so at the time, the new powers were really, everyone was really focused on the reason to put them into place was to save the budgets of all the school districts. And so that was the frame that it was in. Although you can, of course, imagine school districts do have, in some states, and like Wisconsin, wide latitude on the curriculum that they teach. And so that is, I would imagine, another place where we would see this issue sort of come to the forefront.
It's so interesting talking about things like this for me personally, coming from Canada and having lived in the UK. Sort of American kind of administrations kind of break all my instincts, right? Because it's just sort of unthinkable, generally speaking, in Canada to think about like the local school board having wide latitude over the curriculum, or people being. I mean, I'm not actually exactly sure how it works, but you can't elect sheriffs in Canada. Yeah. You can't elect judges. I mean, I spoke to a friend in Michigan once. She was working on a campaign for someone to become district attorney or something like that. And she told me that someone running to be a judge can actually ask for campaign contributions from lawyers that might appear before them as a judge. Do you think that school boards, I mean, you don't have to tell me your opinion on this if you don't want to, because I know it's your space, but do you, in an ideal world, do you think that positions like that should be democratic at all?
I think it's really tricky. I mean, when the chips are down, when you can find ways that the idea of federalism, which is what we're sort of talking about here, doesn't work, because you can find very compelling examples where the local decision making has sort of gone off the rails and it's sort of become tyrannical. That's what I experienced as a high school student. Like the high school I went to, I was in a small town in Montana, and they drug searched our lockers with drug dogs like every 3 weeks. And it's like, if you want to do drugs in Montana, the last place you do it is at school. You've got hundreds of miles of empty space in every direction. Like, it was just a show of force by the school board. It was a decision they wanted to sort of send a message to the students for whatever reason, right? And there's much worse things that happen in where school boards are making really bad decisions like that you kind of get that raise up to the news, right? So that's easy to say when that happens, like, yeah, this is not a great idea, right? But then you take the flip side, right? And you have a president like Donald Trump. And, not to be too political, but if you don't agree with what he's doing and he's a powerful leader, you have your locally elected school board, which can resist because they have their own legitimate authority. And so it's not a great system on either end of the scale, but it is sort of designed to be that relief valve when you sort of disagree with what the other levels of government are doing. It's much easier to get on the school board, to participate in a school board race, than it is to get to the state legislature or get to the national legislature. And so I think that is why the fundamental tension really just is fascinating to me, because I feel in myself, if the education leaders were going to make the decisions I'm going to make, then I don't want them to be elected. Let's just have them be unelected. But if I'm in a position where they're not making the decisions I would make, an election's a great way. It's not too difficult to get my friends and I organized and to try to change things by getting people on the school board. And so I don't have a good answer. I think it's one of the great questions posed by the American system.
Yeah, thank you for that really great answer. I mean, you captured the sort of paradox, that, inescapable paradox of sort of, tyranny versus agency,
right?
Very well. And it's one of the things that really preoccupies me. I mean, that kind of thing that you're describing, for example, where there are people who are nominally grown adults who are exercising this totally arbitrary power for its own sake to intimidate children and get the rush of feeling like an authority over them. That's the kind of agency that really, really bothers me. And like, it's sort of like, this is also a kind of this is a very high level kind of observation, right? But if you have an organization that's nominally exists for one purpose, but it has a certain kind of ethos, that ethos is going to attract people who are attracted to that ethos, not whatever the institution actually exists to do. So, for example, if you have a very hierarchical top-down management structure in your company, it doesn't matter if you're making socks or if you're making guns, you're going to attract the kind of person who likes being in a top-down hierarchical organization, whether that means being at the top or at the bottom. You're going to attract the kind of person who just enjoys having underlings to order around.
Yep.
And if you have a situation where people understand that, I was elected to exercise my personal will. For me, I was elected, not appointed as part of an administration or an organization, but actually it's me. And you look around and you have the gaze of power upon the people around you. That's just something that really bothers me. But the other side of it is like, there's people who think, well, that's what everyone in a position of authority is doing.
Yes.
The very concept that you could just be a kind of like featureless person who's simply there as a representative of an organization. Some people just don't believe that that's a thing.
Yeah. Yeah. I think one way that we do try to square the circle in America is we do, like in education specifically, we do have state education agencies which are charged with sort of setting parameters within which school districts can be free, so that state constitutions, for the most part, give the state the decision about how to organize schools, and they defer a lot of that to districts. But there's a lot of power struggles between districts and states, and they do different things differently. And that relationship sort of ebbs and flows, as it did while I was in Wisconsin and continues to do. So I think that part of it does also make it, the promise there is that, well, if things get too far out of hand and you are stuck in a community that you just can't get enough people on the school board to change things, you can, make a legal case that your rights are being violated, and you can be protected that way from a higher level of government. Or you can get the state to pass laws to change or set boundaries on what the school district's allowed to do. And that, I think, is why I think we're always thinking we're going to do a school education reform and then we did it and now we're going to see how it worked. But it's actually that it's a continuous cycle of sort of balancing the power between the different levels, especially between states and districts. And I think it's very tricky to keep an eye on.
Since we're only asking easy questions
Yeah.
in this interview, I thought I'd ask another easy one, which is, there's obviously a big education controversy going on in the States right now, particularly with, primary and secondary schools.
Yes.
And there's one in actually in the province of Alberta in Canada right now as well, where, and this is, the sort of province, the provincial government is proposing province-wide curriculum that would have to be taught everywhere, and the teachers and lots of parents are pushing back on various features of it. There's there's the high politics, and then there's the like, should math be rote memorization in grade one, like that kind of thing. And I guess the question I want to ask is, why isn't it a sort of sufficient solution for some people to just say, tell your kids don't believe everything they hear in school?
Yeah.
Like, why? Because for me, I mean, like I was saying in my story, like this is a big part of my own origin story, was like learning, and not in a negative or a kind of reactionary way. I just learned, oh, school's kind of an arbitrary place. Why is it not? And why is it that some people don't want that to be the answer? That you can just tell your kids, just don't believe everything you hear in school.
Yeah, I don't know about, I mean, I bet that is how most people are acting. I feel like a lot of the education debate is about sort of intentionally, trying to charge up issues and raise them up to be have a lot higher volume than they do. The real issues in education, don't get this much attention, right? The real core issues of, funding and access to extracurriculars and, the decisions about, like, should we be teaching kids computer science instead of trigonometry for a year, right? And like, are our schools sites of economic training, or are they sites of cultural training? And how much is that balance? Those are like core issues that I think really most people do think about and have really strong opinions about their schools. And then these other issues sort of become ways, I think, for partisan politics to kind of get pushed down onto something that everyone cares about education because everyone went through it. And so it's a really good way to connect emotionally with people as a political strategy to say, hey, schools aren't like how they were when you were a kid, and you either really like that or you really don't. And I'm going to try to put that into a partisan spin so that you'll vote for me for a different level of government that's not really deeply involved. And there's a lot of really interesting research about school teachers' resistance to when these partisan things sort of get pushed. So when there is a curriculum mandated, but the sort of teachers as professionals say, this curriculum isn't really that good, I'm going to work around it or sort of hide it, right? And there's a long history of that in the profession of teaching and studies of that. And I think those things are sort of how these things actually wind up playing out. And I think the mindset you're sort of talking about is both a mindset that I think school officials might take, like, don't believe everything the legislature tells us is required, or wink, nudge, let's move on. And I think that parents often, with their kids are probably saying, like, you got to kind of just go along with this one with the school. And I think that does a disservice, right? Because of what you said about the ethos and the culture, like, what is that, how does that sort of play out? But I think it's how it does play out in reality in a lot of cases. But that's not as good of a news story.
I'm going to try and do a sort of segue from the sort of 30,000 feet to the real sort of like in the mud kind of stuff. But have you ever read Anti-Intellectualism in American Life by Richard Hofstadter?
I think I've probably read a excerpt from it in a political theory class, but it's been a while.
Yeah, well, and the book is quite old now. It's, from the 1960s, but I read it a little while ago, and a lot of it read like it had been written, the other day. But he's got a really, really great chapter in there about the history of education in the United States. And I just remember when I read it, it was such a sort of like, bucket of cold water about the fact that actually mass education, the fact that, as you said, everybody has to go through it. This is a recent thing in human history, like very recent. And in fact, really mass education, particularly in the United States, really only started in the very early 20th century. And And at that time, it was tackling very particular problems in certain places where the like administrations started to appear, like in New York, where there were a lot of immigrants,
Yes.
for example, and you had to teach people like not only, Shakespeare, but home ec, and just how to live. How do you live in this urban environment in this new life? And with new technologies like sewerage and electricity and things like that, there were all sorts of really practical matters. But essentially we're still in the beginning of the experiment, and really we're now in this stage where we have sort of technologies and things like that where we can gather and process and visualize data in a way that we couldn't before. So we're still at the beginning, but we're kind of maybe at the end of the beginning or something like that, if you want to be romantic about it, of this great experiment. And you've been a part of that, and you did work on something called an early warning system, part of your work for the state government, I believe. And I was wondering if you could talk a little bit, and you've got a chapter about it in your second book. And I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about what an early warning system is, and the one that you worked on, and how one can build an early warning system in an education department.
Yeah, I think that's a pretty good segue. So hats off to you. Because the early warning system is at the other end, right? It's about solving administrative challenges and sort of making the sort of education system, more have fewer I guess I tell people it's kind of a safety net for the education system. A lot of people want to think of it as very prescriptive, but what I learned in doing it, I think, is that it's more of a tool to augment the existing work in the way we use a lot of other tools to augment work. So just really briefly, in the Wisconsin example, which is what I build the chapter in the book around, but I advise other people on developing similar systems as part of Civilytics now in education and elsewhere. And the idea is in education of an early warning system is that if we are generating data from students are giving us information. We have data systems to collect that information. What we want to do is get a sense of whether a student is quote unquote on track to meet some objective or goal that we have as an education system. The sort of easiest one to think of is just graduating with a diploma in high school. And so it's students who are less likely to graduate, they start to exhibit behaviors that put them on a track that they're not going early. And schools typically have many ways to identify this, but an early warning system is another way to do that sort of at scale by using a limited set of information that we have about every student and building a statistical model that determines whether or not that student is likely to complete on time or not complete on time. And then communicate that information to someone who can help change that outcome from potentially a negative outcome to a positive outcome of them completing on time. And the idea is that we know from research that it's much harder to take a 17-year-old who's about to not graduate and move them to being a graduate. It takes a lot of intensive intervention. School systems, some of them are okay at this, others really struggle with it. It's much easier to gently improve the way the student interacts with the school system from, say, grade 5 on, and try to improve the school system to better serve those types of students at the same time. It gives us a longer chance to sort of improve things. There's risks associated with early warning systems. And so that's one of the things that it really matters, the sort of context that it's built into. You have to be very careful about how people are going to use it and who has access to it, and how it is sort of kept up to date and kept current, which is a lot of what the chapter in the second book covers. But the idea is that schools make these judgments all the time. They have to do their jobs. And this is a way to support that judgment, to say, just in case, just quickly check this list and see if you don't have a plan or a strategy to help any of these students who you might have missed because the pattern of behavior that they're showing is a little subtle, or you just you had too much on your plate. So it's sort of a safety net for professional educators to feel like, okay, we also can check this resource to make sure we're serving all the students we need.
It's just such a difficult job. I mean, I only know it from the outside, having been a student, but when you mentioned risks, one might think, oh, what's the risk of an early warning system? And it's like, well, a self-fulfilling prophecy. Yes. That's one. And another is angry parents.
Yes.
You're saying my kid's smart. What are you saying? My kid's dumb. And now all of a sudden that might make the outcome that you're trying to avoid more likely,
Yes.
in it's another version of the self-fulfilling prophecy. And I guess one question I have is, so when we talk early warning system, I live in a, tsunami zone,
Yeah.
right? So to me, early warning system is like my phone goes off and it's like, oh no, knock on wood. When we're talking about this in sort of the like 2021 and the kind of early warning system you talk about in your chapter in the book, is this like a teacher gets an email like saying, boom, our system says that, Joe is now at stage 1 of difficulty, or do you provide them with a series of sort of metrics that they can check student performance against, and so the teacher themselves says, oh, it looks like this student might be falling into a bad pattern?
It's really interesting in right now where we are. So DEWS, the Wisconsin Dropout Early Warning System, I started working on it in 2013, and I think we, as a team, we pushed it out around 2015. So that was, it's hard to believe, but it does for me. Like the technology then is very different than the technology now, which is just wild to think about. But I think people are really innovating on these. So there are systems, or there are school systems using tools where they are trying to give more real-time alerts. There are places where they're just giving like a report. In the case of DEWS, this will get into mud a little bit here. Wisconsin, the state, had our data came very slow. So school districts would report everything about their students to us twice a year. So we had 2 time points a year at which we got new information about students. And we had a number of mechanisms to report information back to schools, but not to the teacher level. So we could report something to a principal, but we couldn't report something to a specific teacher at the time. But what we learned, we did a bunch of user interviewing and presenting about this idea at conferences with educators. And we're like, we're thinking of doing this. I think we can do it pretty accurately, but we don't know how to communicate it to you, or like what would be useful. And they said, at the beginning of the year, we often sit down and like think about how are we going to help different students. And we do that for like we try to do it for all of our students. And sometimes, we are looking through that list and we look at their past performance. We look at how they did last year, what their grades were. So if you could give us a list at the beginning for that meeting, we could bring that to that meeting and we could incorporate that information into it. So we wrote a guide on how to interpret the information. We did a pilot with several schools to show them that information, and kind of got their feedback about what that would be. And then what was unfortunate for me, again, getting into the mud, is that the first data was was preliminary data. So I had to build a sort of a secondary early warning system to make the prediction on time to be useful for them in that process. And then we would send them an update later in the year to say, these are the students who changed after we got the final data. So maybe that information is helpful. But they told us, if you don't tell us at the beginning of the year, it's going to go into an inbox and we're not going to be able to sort of put it into this process that we have. And so that was really eye-opening for us to think about that. And I think there's now a lot of innovation about how to do that. I think there's a real risk of like with the early warning system. If your phone went off about the tsunami every week, when the tsunami finally came, you might not run, right? And so you have to be really careful about what sort of that behavior winds up being. And I think we're just at the beginning of starting to think about that, like human computer interacting with our sort of professional job, especially a professional job like being a teacher. And like, how does that sort of cumulatively wind up? Is it going to be like the notifications on my phone where I just stop paying attention after a certain point because I can't get them to go away? We want to be thinking about that. I think that's what the field I think is going to be trying to work on in the future.
I hadn't thought about that before. I think you've written somewhere about, having too much data and how that can be a problem. This is a problem that data scientists sort of like sort of backhanded complain about, I've got too much data, damn it.
Yeah.
But providing teachers with too much data or like, and it's the same thing with, the sort of people who are making the policy decisions too. Like it needs to be informative and thoughtful about the context in every touch point.
Yeah. And it comes back to really, what I had to learn, why the DEWS project will always be special to me is like really spending time thinking about just the professional skill that the principals and the counselors and the teachers bring to their job. Like my algorithm is adding something, but it's adding a lot less than I thought it was when I started, because they are, and I would tell them this, like they hold in their heads a very sophisticated processing system for identifying when students are in trouble and how to reach out to them. And so it's really about how do we fit a system in that augments that or improves it or protects them against, a mistake, or helps them feel more effective, right? And to maximize the really powerful part of the education system, which is the educators interacting with students. And the one way that really came home for me is one of the people on our design team who worked with me on designing it. She showed me once a spreadsheet she used as a principal. And she made a spreadsheet that was like our early warning system. And she scored the students and she ranked them. And she would spend hours typing the data into the spreadsheet and then getting her results. And she was like, if all you did was replace the spreadsheet, so I had those hours back, like that's going to be a really big step forward for us. Because I felt like I needed to do this spreadsheet to be sure to like feel comfortable that we're doing everything we can. But I also was the one who had to do it. And so when she told me that, I was like, that is really where it slots in. It's maybe not as meaningful as I think some people want to imagine it is, but it's also it can be a very powerful part of the system. And once it's built, like any data science product, it scales really well. So we're making, in Wisconsin, they're making hundreds of thousands of predictions a year for school systems that have no capacity to set up a system like that for themselves.
My next easy question is about standardized testing. I remember having an experience in school once when I had no idea what was coming. And all of a sudden I was given a standardized test. And I sort of like, I had to figure out, you have to fill out circles. Okay. And, so like they had to figure out how to do the test, and before I could even sort of get to answering the questions. And in the end, the results came back and I was told I should be an accountant. And I was in like grade 8 and I was like, I didn't have the words, but it was like, fuck you to the test and whoever was telling me that. No offense to accountants out there meant at all. But, it was basically, I think, and it was because I finished it so fast. And it was just this, again, like I didn't have the word, but it was such an arbitrary conclusion to come to, right? You're fast at filling out forms, so you should be an accountant. And it's like, there's the real insult to accountants, right? Like, it's actually a really complex job, that involves a lot of creativity and things like that. And I guess just my general question, if you were sitting in a pub and, your new brother-in-law found out what you do and he asked you, what do you think of standardized testing? What would you say?
I think they serve a function, and they are used in ways that is far from the function that they serve today. And one of the things I grapple with very much is like when that happens. So I think standardized tests are overused. Kids are tested way too much, and way too much is put on the stuff that it can be tested compared to the stuff that cannot be tested. And I really empathize with education officials who feel like they're really under a lot of pressure to sort of make this magic box produce the numbers that need to be produced for them to sort of justify what they're doing. I do think that is a challenge, a very big challenge. What I worry about is, so could we go back to using them sort of more justly or more fairly? I don't know. Like we got the power and we used it wrong. Like it just sort of has devolved. So what's to stop us from, we reset the way we use standardized testing. We try to go back to using it for informational purposes, for sort of measuring long-term performance, and for thinking about using it to validate other things that we know about schools. Well, won't we just creep back into the same patterns and start using tests to test how we're going to do on the test? And I guess I feel particularly conflicted because the standardized tests in Wisconsin was very, very useful for that early warning system predictor. It does a very good job of helping us find out whether students are on track to graduate. Not in the way you think. You don't have to do very well on the test to be on track to graduate. But if you did very poorly on the test, that is a very clear signal that the school system is not doing a good job to find out how to help students in that situation find a path to success. The problem is that we kind of maybe put that on the student and their family as like, well, they should do better on the test, instead of thinking about actually what the test is supposed to be telling us is that as a school system, we're not finding a way to connect and to make this experience meaningful and productive. And I think a big part of that comes down to resources. And I think a big problem about standardized testing is that they're sort of what we're seen as a powerful tool to sort of chip away at the resources schools have, instead of a tool to help us say, where do we need to put more resources into the school system? And so if we're going to have a subtractive mentality about it, I wouldn't want to keep using standardized tests, but I do find there is probably a way that they could be used that would be okay.
You've brought up money and funding a couple of times in this interview, and it is fascinating how contentious that can be, particularly in education, not just sort of kindergarten to grade 12, but also in higher education as well. I remember, I think it was in the early aughts in the UK, a system was brought in to sort of forget what it was called now, but it was to assess professors. And it was because people wanted to know, where's our money going, right? And you need to show me some number in the end, right? And I say this aggressively and angrily because it's a bullshit mentality. And what all of a sudden profs had to do was start tabulating their mentions. And so how many times is the paper that they, how many papers have they published? How many papers have they published multiplied by the rank assigned to the journal that they're published in, and then how many times have you been cited? The research assessment exercise, I think it was called, something like that. And all of a sudden, profs are spending. And you mentioned before the teacher who's spending all the time doing the spreadsheet, doing analysis that hopefully someone else whose job is analysis could do instead. Now all of a sudden, you had a bunch of professors doing all this kind of analysis, and again, a completely arbitrary system that's there basically so a politician could say at the end of the day, we should be paying. Always what the goal is we should be paying profs less.
Yes.
Because they're not getting cited enough and they're not publishing enough, those lazy jerks. And I guess, I don't know if that's, maybe this is just one of those other paradoxes, right? If a public school system is, coming from taxation and it's being given to teachers to do a job, there's going to be someone somewhere who's like, show me the results.
I think public performance management is something I'm very fascinated by because you could poll 100 people in your town and they'll give you 100 different answers of what the school system's supposed to do. So it's not like a publicly traded company where we're supposed to return value to the shareholders. Like, at least we can all agree that's what we're here to do. But when we walk into a school building, we're here to make kids feel safe and supported. We're here to help them express themselves. We're here to make sure they're prepared for the economy. And how do you measure all of those things? You can't measure all of those things.
Actually, I think that's a really great analogy or sort of comparison, right? Because when you think about some of the most successful companies in the world right now, Amazon and Tesla, both famously didn't make any money for a really long time.
Yeah.
And there was sort of the sort of ordinary kind of like stock analyst who's like, why would anyone ever invest in this business? It's never turned a profit. And it's like, well, now, Jeff Bezos and Elon Musk are worth, hundreds of billions of dollars.
Right.
Because they could keep the long term in mind. And the reason I bring up that specific example is that there's something, I think it might be in the province of Ontario here in Canada, where the provincial government was suggesting that they wanted to have a policy where public funding to universities would be partially based on employment outcomes.
Mm-hmm.
Right. And so, and the idea being, borrowing from a discourse that I think is authentic and good, that's critical of basically scam universities that are like, basically you pay a lot of money or you borrow a lot of money to go there, and then you're unemployable at the end. Borrowing from that legitimate discourse, they want to take that and apply it illegitimately to legitimate universities and say, well, you guys who are like teaching like English literature, you're scamming people, right? We're going to try and catch you so we can cut your funding by saying, what proportion of your students actually have jobs within 4 years of graduating, and specifically how much money are they making? And it's like, well, if you judged the performance of a university by, let's say graduation rates, right? Yeah. Well, Harvard really scammed Mark Zuckerberg.
Yeah.
Right. And Bill Gates, wherever he went, or didn't go. This idea of assessment, I just, this is my public service announcement to anyone listening, like, be very wary when people start trying to impose assessments of education outcomes based on, things that seem straightforward, like employment and how much money you make. I studied English literature and I ended up in investment banking.
Yeah, right.
Does that by the sort of assessment that I'm talking about would ascribe failure to the University of Oxford for having trained me in English and taken all my money when I didn't get a job in English in the end.
Yeah.
Anyway,
that's my rant.
Sorry, I'm sure you get those all the time.
Yeah, my favorite thing, like, that there's a book by Deborah Stone called Policy Paradox, and I think it's probably the greatest political science book ever written. I really hope she hears me say that someday, because you can open up to any chapter and it sort of talks about all of these sort of issues about, well, when we want to try to measure performance, there's a political purpose to that, and there are people who are going to win and lose from that sort of strategy, and there are people who have legitimate complaints and people who have like complaints that are made up, that are false, they're crying crocodile tears. And she just like does a lot. She looks at these problems from many different lenses and shows you like how and why they sort of are so difficult to disentangle, and why, it does seem like what starts out as a well-meaning policy, which I think 90% of people would agree, like scam universities are a problem and we don't want to have them, can be shaped and used to make real universities start to function in ways that we would not find optimal or useful or productive to society. And I think, that's also one of those sort of big fundamental paradoxes of making decisions about public goods.
Just moving on, we've been talking for about an hour now, so just moving on to the next part of the interview where we talk about the sort of the writing and the production of your book. So there's 2 books in the series now, Education Data Done Right, and there's a website that we'll link to in the transcription about this project. What was the sort of origin story of this project? Was it you and a bunch of colleagues were sitting around saying, we've got all this knowledge that we can share, but no one sort of is publishing at the kind of meta level about what we do?
So yeah, Wendy, DJ, and I, we met. We're the 3 authors on the first book and the editors and authors on the second volume. And we met at a conference, and we were all trained as social scientists, sort of in this very academic tradition, but found ourselves drawn to this very practical work of working in government. And we were at a meeting for government data analysts to sort of talk and share ideas and talk about data systems and how we do our work. But the meetings mostly tended to focus around really IT stuff, which is critical. And we have a love letter to IT professionals in the first book chapter on why they're important and what's really great. But there wasn't space to talk about how to be an analyst, including making friends with the IT department. So we were coming out of this academic training where the concept of data is like a data set that was been carefully collected and manicured and perfectly laid out like a bonsai tree that you would then analyze. And the data we were dealing with is sort of just like data that's coming off of these systems that are trying to work every day, and they have different conflicting definitions. And so we were like, we weren't really trained for this. And what a lot of people who do what we do or think what we do, they want to talk about what we're doing, because administrative data was a very popular academic topic at the time in education research. But they've never sat inside these rooms where we're arguing about how in this year, all of this data in this one column is a little dodgy because we had a mistake on the form that we collected it in. And like, what does that mean for the rest of the analysis? So these kinds of issues, which to us all seem very fundamental, of like that affects the downstream work much more than people want to sort of think. We're like, well, there's got to be some book about this or some ideas about how to do this job. And we, there's some stuff in other fields that we found inspiring, but we found there's a lot of books about education data science that start with, you now have your data set. Here's how to run a neural network on it. And we're like, well, there's a lot of things you might want to check before you run that neural network, including like who made the data set and what was their agenda. And so we put the first book together, and it was really focused on, I think, the like data preparation, uncovering errors, and being really thoughtful about documenting that. And sort of what I think is the really great work that, for example, a really great statistical agency like the US Census Bureau is very thoughtful about. They have very good procedures about that, but they're also not super public about everything they do because they have to protect confidentiality of every person in the country. So, but I know they have really good procedures. We need to bring that sort of professionalism and standard to the education data work happening in state education agencies and school districts as they're building these more and more complicated data systems. And so that's really the origin story.
And the first book, I believe, was published in 2019.
Yes.
And you collectively chose to self-publish it, I believe, and it was on Amazon and at least and presumably elsewhere as well. Was there a reason that you and your co-authors decided to self-publish as opposed to maybe approaching an education publisher or something like that?
I think there's two reasons. One is we wanted to go quickly at the time. So we had a set in 2019, we had a sort of, we all kind of had this moment like, I think I can work on this right now. We want to move really quickly. And so we found I was really energized by the idea of self-publishing because I was like, well, we actually know the people we're writing this book for, so most of them, a lot of them personally. And like, we can really find this and put this in their hands on our own. And we just don't want to, we don't need to deal with the timeline of a publisher, finding a publisher. And I also I'm not interested in trying to make it shape into some sort of publisher's narrative or fit in their portfolio of books. I knew what I knew, and I think DJ and Wendy, we knew what chapters would be really helpful, and we were like, let's just put them together, bundle it up. And our longer term vision was we want other people to write chapters, and then we wanted to be the ones to put their words out and to share, because we knew a lot of our colleagues were super smart. 3 of them joined us for the next book and had really great ideas and would benefit the field to hear from them and for them to get the space to really show what they do, because unlike academics who have to, get their reference scores up to make sure they meet their metrics, there's not a lot of like sort of professional cachet for publishing for education data researchers in education agencies. But some of them still really want to do that, and they feel a sense of sort of community and contributing to the community. So self-publishing seemed like it would allow us to sort of, if we were lucky and the book resonated, that people could be able to contribute to it as well and feel more part of the process than if we had to go through a big publisher.
This is the part of the podcast we save it for the end, where we get into the weeds about sort of writing and the process of putting the books together and stuff. And I was curious what tools you decided to use to actually make the ebook files in the end that you published.
Yeah, so I think this is also where co-authoring is tricky, right? So, I've already worn on my sleeve in this interview that I'm an R guy. So I could write my stuff in a plain text file, and then I would use the R bookdown package to package up the ebook files. And, in the R bookdown community, they are big fans of LeanPub, and there are many LeanPub books that come out of the R bookdown package, and people have really lifted up LeanPub as a really great place to put that. And that's how I found out about it. And so I was like, well, let's do it this way. And then DJ and Wendy were kind of like, I just want to write a book. So we wrote and we wanted to write it together. So we wrote most of the chapters as manuscripts in Google Drive and shared documents. But then we did typeset it into R. I typeset it into R using R bookdown so that I could apply some formatting. And I wrote my dissertation using LaTeX. So I was able to do a little more than the basic formatting, not too much, but a little bit. We got a designer to put the cover on it. And then I learned a lot about Mobi, EPUB, and PDF files from that sort of process. It wasn't quite as plug and play as the sort of book down manual had led me to believe, but I do think that it was, in the end, it was a really good process, and the volume 2 went pretty smoothly using the same process.
And did you hire editors? Did you ask people to volunteer to read the chapters before they were put into the book?
We found colleagues who wanted to be part of the book, but were not willing or comfortable, didn't have the time to be full-on authors. And we said, well, could you be a reviewer? So we got, for every chapter, we asked a colleague in a similar role somewhere, and we thanked them in the book to be sort of a content reviewer. Like, does this, are we on the right path? Does this seem like it would help you in your job? And then we did, for volume 1, we hired an editor who was a friend of Wendy's. And for volume 2, I had a research assistant who served as our editor for our chapters. And then we each also got our own chapter edited. It was a bit more, because there were 6 authors this time, we kind of were a little more diverse in the process.
And I was very intrigued to see in the second book, I believe, you mentioned in the introduction that it's a living document, which is for LeanPub, that's our favorite kind of book.
Yeah.
We love all books. But I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about what you mean by that and what your plan is for the book.
Well, what we hope is, one, if people catch typos, that we can, quickly cover those up and, submit a new file and make sure people, we're putting our best foot forward. And I find that's actually really great. Like, that's an underrated value of self-publishing. Like once you put it out with a publisher, they're not going to want to do another run and fix your typos, but you can, cover that up. It can get better. And it's a great way to get engagement with the readers, right? People, you like, hey, thanks. We can make a section that says, thanks for these edits. Thanks for this person who caught the typos. People can be part of the book, even if they don't feel like they have maybe a whole chapter worth of something to say. I think that's really powerful. And I think the second thing is perhaps whether it's in a volume 3 or if we add chapters to volume 2 over time, I think we're still thinking about that, but we do hope that people say, this really fit with me. I'd like to share my experience about it. And then we can just keep adding that so that people get the new content that comes out and they feel like, because in our case, like I said, I can kind of picture the room of people who this book belongs to as well, which I think would make it a hard pitch to a publisher. The audience is small. I would guess there's 5,000 people in the country that this would be really up their alley. But, if we reach them all, that's great. We don't, that's totally fine. But what I think is great is if I can, get some of them to share what they know, and create a way that makes them kind of feel more connected to each other. That's really the goal, because what the real epiphany behind the book that Wendy, DJ, and I had was actually we wanted to write a book together because we were all sitting in a room and we're like, we are not alone. Like we all have these same thoughts and same things with our job. And we wanted to give that sort of feeling back to folks. And so that just seems like a way to show that we're really open to that sort of ongoing conversation.
Yeah, thanks very much for sharing that story. That's so great. I mean, that's, one of the reasons we exist, Leanpub exists, is to sort of provide a venue for like very good, highly specialized books that maybe have a smaller audience than any ordinary publisher would settle for, and also people who are kind of motivated by their mission in a way that sort of means that sort of slotting into a publisher's marketing schedule and publication timeline just doesn't match. There's nothing wrong with those things. It just doesn't match. Right. But I would say though, having gone through the books, that if you're in an organization and you're trying to bring in data, these books are really great. I mean, whatever your organization is, whether it's in government or whether it's in a company, and I've interviewed a lot of people in this podcast from who have similar problems, like very similar kinds of problems to address in companies. This is actually a good sort of case study. They're good case studies for the kinds of problems you can encounter in any kind of organization, trying to bring in sort of data science, trying to manage it, things like that. And I can't help myself but mention about typos. One of the reasons that Leanpub, people often think it's just sort of for programming books, and that's because it's very popular with programmers, because if you're writing a program and you've got a typo, the whole thing blows up.
Yes.
And so the idea of books that could be like instantly changed and you just click a button and it's changed for everybody really appeals to programmers.
Yeah.
I mean, and it's if you're reading a line in a book and it says it was the best of times, it was the blurst of times, you're like, oh, he meant worst. That's fine, moving on. But if you're showing a code sample in a book and the code sample's wrong, you really need to be able to fix it.
Yes.
The last question I always save on this podcast, if the guest is someone who's published a book on Leanpub, is if there was any magical feature we could build for you and your team, or if there was anything that you found incredibly frustrating or even broken about Leanpub, what would you ask us to do for you?
I'm not sure that I have any problems about. I think the thing that always in both times, and I wrote myself a big note in case we do volume 3, is that there are a lot more like metadata things to fill out when you list a book than I think about. So that's my job. I'm sort of the author responsible for that. But in this case, when I had 5 co-authors, I realized, well, I didn't actually agree with them on what we were going to do as the short description, what we were going to do as a full description. And like, I didn't have like a sort of a checklist of things to run by all of them. So I was like, I'm going to list the book tonight. It's going to go live. And then I was like, oh, follow-up email. I need you all to be sure that you're comfortable with this information that's going to be listed on the listing page. I think that listing process, just having like a checklist or something for authors to be aware of like that in case they're working with co-authors. If you're working on yourself, I'm sure it wouldn't be a problem, but coming up with it on the fly with co-authors was a little tricky.
Oh, that's really interesting. Yeah, we've never had someone suggest that before, but we do have various kind of guides in our help center, for our various writing modes. And then like, what if you're translating a book, things like that. And actually having one for like, just what are some of the things about we do have an article about how to set up co-authors on a LeanPub book, but that's sort of more of a technical how to write it thing rather than a kind of what are the challenges of co-authoring a book. And I've certainly heard a lot from people on this podcast about those kinds of challenges, including the kind of thing you're talking about. So I'll definitely put that on our list of things to do, because that it can be really helpful for people to sort of not have to reinvent the wheel every time they do something like that. Well, Jared, thank you very much for taking the time to talk to everybody today. And thank you very much for using LeanPub as one of the platforms for publishing your books.
Well, thanks so much for having me, Len. And yeah, thanks for making LeanPub. Like, it did make it possible for us to be able to communicate this topic and share it with our audience. And it was I don't think we would have thought of writing a book if we didn't know there was a platform for which we could sort of do that wasn't requiring us to go the route of a publisher. So, I think it is really serving that purpose. And it's been strange to sort of become an author through that process and sort of go through that. So we, from all of us at the EDDR team, we're very grateful for the opportunity to be able to do that and to build our community around those texts.
Oh, well, thank you very much. We really appreciate it. And I'm going to make sure to tell everybody on the team about that.
Great.
Thanks. And as always, thanks to all of you for listening to this episode of the Front Matter podcast. If you like what you heard, please rate and review it wherever you found it. And if you'd like to be a LeanPub author yourself, please check out our website at leanpub.com. Thanks.